This is episode 406 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Clif Horace. He is the principal at Horace Motors in Farmington, New Mexico. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Clif.
Good morning.
Yeah, and let's start with a little bit of history of yourself, your car dealership. I don't need a commercial completely, but you can tell us what kind of makes and models you sell, and a little bit about what's going on up in Farmington on the car front.
Yeah, well, I've been in the business for a long, long time. In fact, my family has also. We date back to 1918 when we were Nash and Hupmobile dealers in the city of Chicago, and we've ridden the waves up and down. The automobile business is very dynamic. Sometimes you get the bull, and sometimes the bull gets you. So we got a chance to start over again in 1983 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. My father and I, and at one point in time, we owned 4 dealerships between the two of us. I've since consolidated that down to a Nissan and Hyundai dealership up in Farmington, New Mexico. I'm very much a student of the business. I do a 3-hour call-in radio show, Four Corners Car Talk, and have for 15, 18 years, where we field calls from all over the country about cars and EVs and what's going on in the industry, everything from buying them and selling them and trading them to fixing them. I have an engineering background, so if I get a little geeky, I apologize. And I can give you a little history of what the state's been discussing with the Clean Air Act. So
Yeah, well, that's obviously the broader topic that I want to talk to you is the recently adopted by the Environmental Improvement Board, unelected bureaucracy at the behest of Governor Lujan Grisham, the so-called Clean Car Standard. But before we get to the ins and outs of that, why is it that a unelected board in New Mexico can make such a dramatic decision as adopting these standards? And we'll talk about those standards later. And even more so, how is it that California got to be the state that we are tying our star to, so to speak, and numerous other states have done the same thing? Talk a little
yeah,
bit about that history.
yeah. So their board in California, which is called Carb, which is California Air Resource Board, it's not elected either.
Mm-hmm.
So literally, you're ceding a lot of power to another state with an unelected board. Let's go back in time, in somewhere in the 60s, and don't quote me on this exactly, but late 60s, California had huge clean air issues, particularly in LA. I remember flying into LA and just flying through the layers, and they wanted to do something about it. They went to the federal government and they said, one of the biggest cause of the smog is automobiles. We would like you to up your emission regulations. At that time, the federal government didn't want to do that. California applied to the federal government and said, look, we would like to have our own standards. The federal government says, no, we monitor or we regulate interstate commerce, and this would involve interstate commerce since the vehicles that you're selling would cover all the different states. The federal government at that time made the decision to make an exception for California, and they gave them the ability to regulate their own emissions. California, through Carb, took that and they upped the emission requirements repeatedly, very aggressively. Now, only California, maybe a couple other states, could have done this because there's such a huge economic power. They're like the 7th largest economy in the world, I think. So they went to the manufacturers and they said, we don't want you selling, we won't allow you to sell a single car unless you meet A, these emission rules, and B, these mandates. The mandates being not only the emission of the car, but we want to see a certain amount of EVs. Now, this was back in the 60s and the 70s. The manufacturers then began to build cars that were California emission cars, and then there was for the rest of us. Certain other states, and it's up to now 14 states, have since adopted those rules out of California. So they use whatever California says is what they're doing, and mostly they're coastal states. A lot of East Coast, New York, I'm not sure about Pennsylvania, but I think Maine, and then you've got California, Oregon, and Washington adopted these rules. Probably the only flyover state that has California emission rules is Colorado, and we'll address that in a little bit. So there were some mandates and initiatives, and after a while, the manufacturers got very frustrated. They also paid a premium on their cars in California, and they were typically an extra $200-300. The manufacturers slowly caught the emission levels up to what California was doing, and at one point in time, when Governor Richardson in New Mexico, there was probably 70% of what automobile dealers were selling were what we call 50 state emission compliant. Fast forward to today, and it's 100%, and it's been that way probably for the last 5-7 years. Every single vehicle that we sell is 50 state emission compliant. It can be sold in California or any other state. So this allows for the easy distribution of vehicles that suit the needs of that particular state, whatever the case may be. Okay, so now you've got Carb and you've got California. Let's look at in a brief history of Carb in New Mexico. Governor Richardson wanted that there's a lot of street cred, I guess, if you will, if you're going to move to the national stage, of being a member of this, whatever it is. It's just, we call it Carb, but joining California in their emission rules. So he signed up. It was a little bit of a joke to us because everything was 50%, or I mean, everything was basically 50 state compliant. So all we did was run around and put stickers on the cars, which are PZEV, which from an engineer's point of view, make you crazy because it's partial zero emission vehicle. You can't have a partial zero, right? Anything times zero is zero, but I digress. So Richardson adopted them. They were onerous. They slowed down the trade from in and out of the state. There was all these regulations, and it really wasn't helping anything. Along came Susana Martinez. She looked at it and said, you know what? We don't need to do this anymore. It's just adding a layer of bureaucracy, and all the vehicles are compliant anyway. So why are we doing this? So she got rid of it. Fast forward to today, and that's the situation we're in now. Is that there's a certain amount of credibility or some ticket that needs to be punched, and that's why you look at California emissions. There's a lot of pluses and minuses. There's a lot of, and I can get into those too, of the pluses and minuses of the ruling and unintended consequences. So,
not to put too kind of basic a point on it, but when I was a kid, of course, and so this goes back a number of years, but you talked about the 60s and 70s. So certainly by the time I was a kid, just to age myself a little bit, this was already in effect. But you'd watch the game shows, and they would always say California emissions, and that's one of the other manifestations of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
All right. So so California has been in the ballgame for a while on this issue, and New Mexico kind of almost did under Richardson, but pulled back out of it with Susana Martinez. And those regulations, as I understood them, were really also targeted at the oil and gas industry. I know that's not your area.
I believe that is true. I'm not familiar with it at all, even though
because the Rio Grande Foundation was involved in them at the time, and they did push through the Environmental Improvement Board. Now, but again, before we get into the specifics of these new rules and their justification, what's the reasoning behind allowing a unelected board to do this as opposed to the state legislature? And that could be in California, or it could be right here in New Mexico. Are you familiar with that aspect?
Why? Well, I think overall, the desire is to reduce CO2 emissions. And you know what? I've got no problem with that. Let's reduce them. I don't, I, that's where you see the push towards EVs, towards renewable energy. That's where it comes from. I have a problem with how it's being administered. So
right. It just
words,
seems.
Let's just cut to the quick.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of unintended consequences from it, and we can get into the details of there's not enough charging stations, how your power is generated. If you're pushing for EVs to become the standard in the state, but you haven't built up your renewables, you're just charging them with coal-fired power. There's a ton of issues that are involved that will sort themselves out over time, and become the emissions right now of all vehicles sold across the United States are 50 state compliant. They meet California emissions and they meet federal emissions. So if you're a regulatory board and you want to regulate something, because you get up and that's what you do for a living, is you regulate things. What happens now is that you want to regulate or mandate what people buy. Well, that's very difficult to do. This is the second largest purchase people will make in their lives, and they're very particular, and they should be. If they want to buy a vehicle that will suit their needs, meet their budget, be socially or not socially responsible, depending upon how their view is, and they're going to buy what they want to buy, regardless of whether it's mandated. Now, if you mandate it across the country, that's a different. But there's I don't know if elasticity of demand is the right term for it, but if I need an F-350 that will pull 13,000 pounds, I can't do that with an EV. It's not possible.
Right.
So, and because it's mandated that a certain percentage of EVs need to be sold in the state, and I can't get it in the state, I just go out of state.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that. My point is purely on the democracy issue. That there are a lot of policies and very important policies. We're dealing with the Energy Transition Act and shutting down coal-fired power plants, which is a related issue to this, as you just alluded to. But why can an unelected board in the state of New Mexico do something as dramatic as this when we just had a legislative session where the legislature, for the second time in a row, rejected so-called clean fuel standards, which would have forced people to use more ethanol and more quote-unquote biofuels that aren't ready for prime time in your gas tank. It failed again after 2 years of this governor pushing it. But here we are, completely under the radar screen with very little discussion, no media coverage whatsoever. More or less. Certainly, I didn't see anything on the evening news, maybe some journal articles and whatnot. But it just strikes me as odd, an odd quirk of our system here in California and in New Mexico, that you can do something like this through an unelected board. That's my.
So then you need to address that with your legislature and say, and I understand why they do it. Is because they're ceding more and more responsibility for the implementation of the various bills that they pass. And, it creates the unintended consequence, or it promotes the unintended consequences of a bill that's passed. And we've seen that over and over and over again.
Right. Well, for them, the unintended consequence is losing election. The EIB doesn't have that problem. All right. Well, I don't think we're going to get to a satisfactory answer, and I'm not being rhetorical, but it definitely does seem like that is a fundamental problem. And it's one of the reasons, quite frankly, that Rio Grande Foundation didn't engage as actively in this conversation, because the idea of a board appointed by this governor rejecting her policy preference was highly unlikely. Now, as you mentioned, Susana Martinez previously came in and went back on what Richardson had done,
Right.
and we could very easily see that. But before we get into the specifics of this, well, I want to talk a little bit about the specifics, but mostly as an entree to the fact that California really is driving the the EV here. They're driving the
Yes.
Tesla, so to speak.
Right.
So my research says that 2.29% of new vehicle sales in New Mexico are EVs, according to data from the third quarter of 2021, which is what I have.
Is that pure EVs or is that EVs? In EV, let's define what we're talking about here. So there's pure
Yeah.
EVs, which is 100% battery powered. And then you have a whole rainbow of hybrids that
Right.
go from plug-in hybrids that have the ability for the first 40 miles of driving 100% electric, and then have a gas engine to back that up. And then you have standard hybrids like the original Prius, which were
Right.
a gas battery combination.
So this is from the let's see, the quarterly report of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation,
Okay.
and they break it down by states by new cars sold, and it says New Mexico PHEV and BEV. Those are the combined, and I don't even know
Right.
what those stand for, but they turn into
Okay, so they've added in
2.39.
the PHEV as a plug-in hybrid.
Okay.
Right.
So, and that turns into 2.29%. Now, the requirement out of
Right.
California is currently at 7%.
Right.
So that's, tripling by 2025.
Right.
But the kicker, and I think the thing that everybody needs to be most concerned about, is that California's governor, Gavin Newsom, has an executive order pending. It hasn't been formally ratified, if you will, by the unelected board out there in California, but he is pushing for 35% of new cars sold in California to be zero emissions starting in 2026, increasing to 51% by 28, 68% by 2030, and 100% phase out of the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035. Now, that's proposed, but I suspect something like that could easily pass in California, and that means New Mexico is tied to that as well.
Yes.
So
Yes.
talk about that.
Well, that's the fear, you know. And when I was down visiting with the two boards, they were very clear that they were not adopting the future changes in California Air Resource Board's recommendations. I'm not an attorney, and I got my hand slapped down there because I'm not an attorney, because I was confused. It was confusing to me, and the difficult question is that, wait a minute, we're adopting Clean Air Standards 1, which, when we looked at it, the real concern is that New Mexico is considering adopting a rule that will be obsolete before its effective date due to California's plan to sunset Clean Air Cars 1 and adopt Clean Air Cars 2, which then has the mandates. So we can get in the weeds on that. I think that's a question that's going to have to be sorted out in the courts or somebody. Again, I'm not an attorney, but
Well,
I
see one of three routes possible, that we just go along with whatever California says
Right.
and does, which, if this governor and her ideological acolytes rule the day, I could very easily see that. I don't think anybody can truly do this, but they will make a very strong attempt and warp the automobile market dramatically, including pushing people out of state to go buy vehicles in other states. So there's compliance. We kind of just freeze things where we are at any given point, or come up with our own decision. And I don't know what the legality of this is, if we have to follow California or not, or we just pull out, say, a Republican gets elected this fall, i.e. the same way as Martinez did on the heels of Richardson, and the Republican goes through the regulatory process to scotch this whole thing. So those are kind of the three visions I see. What do you see?
So you need to understand, first off, is that, and I will speak for friends of mine that are in the industry. Automobile dealers are very, very gung ho on EVs. Once you've driven them, once you look at some of the advantages, they're fast, they're fun, and they are the future. I mean, they're exciting, and we want to be in the business of selling them and servicing them and taking care of our customers.
And let me
change. What the difficulty then becomes is when you're mandating, you're not allowing the market to function normally.
Right.
Because there's certain areas where an EV is the perfect vehicle in needs and uses. There's also areas where it just simply doesn't fit. And so, we understand, all centrally planned economies, China being the poster child, even China doesn't do this anymore because they realize it doesn't work. They understand that they need to get the ground to have the demand or the supply meet the demand from the ground up. And now you can incentivize it, and that changes behavior. And in fact, most of the states that are under Carb incentivize their EVs.
Right. And that's so
in addition to the federal, in addition to the federal incentive.
Right. I do want to talk a little bit about that. And I'm a little more agnostic. I get it. You're in the business. Their EVs are getting a lot of advertising play. There's a big push for them. There's also a lot of subsidies and mandates. The federal government $7,500 tax credit.
Right.
That's a very generous incentive for electric vehicles and their purchase. And a lot of states, ironically, not New Mexico, have state level incentives directly. P&M, the Public Service Company in New Mexico, has some incentives and a lot of utilities. And then you get into the deployment of the charging stations, et cetera. So that's also an additional expense. But regardless of whether EVs are the future or not, they're definitely, as you said, not for everybody. And I think we certainly agree on that. But there's a lot of problems with EVs just as a general concept. The batteries, mining and all the requirements that go into those.
Right.
There's charging stations.
And we say this all the time on the radio show, which is if I can give a plug, it's Four Corners Car Talk. If you're buying a car, selling a car, trading a car, if you're racing, wrecking them, or just trying to fix them, give us a call.
All right.
The problem with the EV is the battery. It's the battery, stupid. That's what adds the additional cost to the vehicle. So if you look at same size and equipment level of vehicles, one is a gas engine and one is a straight EV. It's about $10,000 more, and all that cost is because of the cost of the battery. So that's one. Two, when you build that EV, and I've seen estimates all over the place, I've seen them higher or lower, but I'll use 40%. They say the carbon footprint of building an EV is 40% greater than it is of building a gas engine car. Whether that's through efficiencies and the various metals that go into the EVs. So when they look at that, but then the counter argument is, well, wait a minute, once you're using the car, you are not burning fossil fuels, so therefore you're reducing your carbon footprint. And that is also true. What's the payback time? We've calculated anywhere from 5 to 10 years on the CO2, on the carbon footprint. You also, if you paid $10,000 more for a vehicle, which a lot of people can't afford, I mean, that puts them out of, the affordability issue is huge on these vehicles. You can imagine if it adds another $100 to your payment. There's just a lot of folks in New Mexico, and because we sell in all 4 states, that say, whoa, and then we can get into the infrastructure, whether I can even charge it. But staying with the CO2 footprint and then the payback, now that fuel has gone up so much, your payback is much better, and I think it's down to like 5 years. So with regards to the $10,000.
I'm not gonna. I'll ask you flat out conspiracy theory here. Uh, it does seem that there's a huge push on the Democratic side, especially this administration, both governor and federal. Uh, they don't like traditional gas-powered vehicles. Uh, I'm not saying they're purposely, but it definitely the the situation would not be much different if the Biden administration was purposely increasing the price of gasoline right now in an effort to push electric vehicles more into the mainstream, et cetera. Uh, you don't have to even answer that if you don't want to, but it almost seems like this is a
Well,
concerted effort to promote electric vehicles by increasing the price of
I,
gasoline.
mean, I have no idea.
Okay, that's fair. I respect that.
But it
Okay,
does change the economics all the time,
absolutely.
right? Because
Dramatically
maybe
changes
you
it.
maybe you don't get your CO2 payback, or or you can't recover your initial higher cost. You can obviously at $4.35 you can recover it a lot quicker. So,
Right. Well, okay, so let's continue with the obstacles.
yeah,
You mentioned a few of them. The big ones that I see are, again, you're in the Four Corners. You're in Farmington. You're shutting down the San Juan. As in
yeah,
the state, is shutting down the San Juan generating station. They've already said they don't have enough replacement power to run the state this summer, although they extended the life of that plant. Now they're saying they have half the solar panels available for next summer. We're dealing with significant electrical grid issues across the American West, which also happens to be where these electric vehicles are most common. Uh, what's going to happen there? And ultimately, you're using fossil fuels still to a large extent to keep the power grid on, or you're using battery technology, which you're competing for the same rare earth minerals and all the stuff that goes into the car
right.
batteries. So how do you square those circles?
So it's the battery, stupid. You now everybody's trying to get the cost of the battery down. Everybody says, "Well, we'll get there in 2028 or whatever the case may be." But every day, in order for renewables to work, they need battery storage. And now you have the automobile manufacturers competing against the grid level storage manufacturers, and it's putting additional pressure on these resources, which are the most expensive things are the cobalt and the nickel. You have a bunch of really smart guys working all around the world to try to change the chemistry of a battery so that you can use less and less of these very expensive. Lithium is fairly available, although most of it comes from China, but it's the nickel and the cobalt that are the expensive parts. And they're also the parts that weigh too much. So going back, you've got a tremendous pressure on these resources. And I was visiting with a gentleman from one of the manufacturers that we deal with, and he said, we thought, so when the first Leaf came out, Nissan Leaf, it was $300 a megawatt. That was the cost to build the battery in the car. And that's what made the car too expensive and also gave it a very limited range, and it didn't sell well. And there's examples prior to that, mandated examples out of California. When they thought they hit the holy grail when they got it to $150 a megawatt. Since then, he says the minerals have been bid up so much by people at the grid level because people like companies like P&M saying, "Low, we're going to shut down coal-fired, we're going to build solar, but we need to store it because we've got the time off shift, the time shift of when power is used versus when it's generated." So there's a lot of demand on batteries that are very, very expensive.
Yeah, definitely batteries are going to be an ongoing
And when you
problem.
mandate it, which in essence, that's a mandate. What did you call it then? ETA, the
Energy Transition Act, yeah.
energy transition. In essence, that mandated it. And now you add another mandate on the automotive side. You're going to inadvertently create a mess.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And that's just on the battery side of things. We won't even talk about all the environmental issues. And I know
Right.
that the Biden administration, I guess to their credit, has at least talked about permitting more domestic mining for copper and other minerals that go into these batteries. And that's absolutely critical to have more domestic mining. But the
Well,
environmental groups are not going to just roll over and suddenly, because it's electric vehicles, jump on board with open pit mining all of a sudden.
right. And since time began, electric motors use copper windings in order to function. And that is true today as it was 100 years ago. So we haven't got away from that. And copper's heavy and it's expensive. So
Yeah. And so I saw, talking more about charging stations now,
right.
I saw a chart that said that New Mexico had 401 charging stations for electric vehicles. I also saw an article last week that in California, in the Bay Area, 27% of all the charging stations there were simply not functional. And of course,
Right.
if you're talking about the epicenter of electric vehicles, it's probably either San Francisco or Los Angeles, and one of the two of them. And these things are expensive. They're often taxpayer financed. They require massive changes to the electrical grid because you need higher voltage. And maybe you can share a little bit about
Yeah.
all
So
the investments that have to happen either at the charging station or in your home to make these electric cars work.
there's 3 or 4 levels of electric chargers, and it all relates to how fast they can charge the vehicle. There's a lot of other issues with charging vehicles faster. You hurt battery life. There's some other things, but to keep it real simple, we estimated that New Mexico needs basically 800 charging stations, 800 more than the 400 that it has, in order to allow people to travel across state. And it wasn't unusual. I mean, when I moved up here to the Four Corners, I was amazed. People would drive to Albuquerque to do their back to school shopping. You can't do that with an EV. It won't happen. So the cost of the chargers, for instance, Farmington Electric, I was involved with them installing them, and we put 7 chargers across the city in convenient places, and they were about $15,000 each. Those were what we call level 2. Level 3 chargers, not we. Well, I was involved with our local PUC in installing them. So.
No, I'm just wondering. The term "we," who is the one paying? Who's paying for it?
Farmington Electric Utility.
Okay, got it.
And so they charge for it, and their hope is that they can recover their cost, but they don't know. If you wanted to put in, so our manufacturers are coming to us and they say, we want to see level 3 chargers, and those are $28,000 each, not including the upgrade to our power service. So they are extremely expensive. I don't know as if you could ever get a return on your investment there. You're simply doing it. We're doing it as a service to our customers. So oddly,
you're doing it, hold on, for a certain group of customers who happen to be, generally speaking, at the very highest end of New Mexico's income scale. So it's yet another way that these subsidies and policies take from the poor and give to the rich, and progressives don't say a peep.
Well, so yeah, as an automobile dealer, we never saw a rebate that we didn't like. But
I understand.
As a taxpayer, I have a huge issue with giving wealthy people rebates to purchase a vehicle that they were going to buy anyway. I mean, I'm not a fan of taking tax dollars and incentivizing consumer behavior. But if you want to change behavior, more than mandates have ever changed behavior, that's how they do it. California does it, Colorado does it. But we kind of digress a little bit here. Let's go back to charging.
Sure.
Yes, it is a problem. And it's the chicken or the egg, the cart before the horse. Am I going to buy an EV if I can't charge it, et cetera, et cetera? But we know that 81% of the people charge their EVs at home at night. Now there's 2 issues with that. One, you're charging when there is no solar generation. So you're charging probably from either wind, a little bit of wind, or fossil fuel generated power. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that EVs make a lot more sense in metros, okay, because that person isn't driving any more than 30 or 40 miles a day. But in metros, you have a lot more density in apartment buildings and things along those lines. And there is if 81% of the people charge at home or at night, those people don't have the ability in the metros to do that. And I don't think there is no economic return on installing charging systems in apartment buildings unless you can charge for it. So
Heaven forbid.
yeah.
Heaven forbid you
So
charge.
yeah, you got all these countervailing arguments on where it's best. Quite honestly, I hate to say it, but a wealthy or a well-to-do consumer who can afford automobiles that are $50,000 and up and can afford the $800 to have, level 2 chargers installed in their home is probably the best market for the car. I live up here. I'm surrounded by reservations. We've still got, I think it's 25% of the Navajo reservation doesn't even have power. How could you mandate, something that, it's just completely impractical for that, segment of the population. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, we don't have a heck of a lot of time left, and I do want to ask you about road maintenance. Of course, there was even a proposal, I think it was
Yes.
Senator Bill Tallman in the New Mexico legislature that
it
would
wasn't
have.
Enough.
It wasn't enough? Okay. Well, I mean, just on their face, on the surface, regardless of paying for roads, I know that battery vehicles weigh more than their gas-powered peers, and that weight causes additional damage to roads over the long term. But more broadly speaking, electric vehicles, as they currently exist, do not pay the state's gas tax, and the more electric vehicles you get, the more free riders you get. So you get another subsidy situation.
Right.
Talk to us about that.
You need to attach to the registration every year of an EV some kind of road tax. And it's really not as much as you think it would be. I think the break even was $188. So an additional, if you buy an EV, you pay an extra $188 a year, and you're covering what you would have spent on your 17 cents a gallon road tax. So that's relatively easily solved. There was some real sophisticated states have looked at some kind of crazy things where they would follow you around and see how many miles you drove and then charge you accordingly. It's easier just to put in you drive on the road, you need to contribute to road maintenance.
Well, I agree with you that is a simple action to be taken, but the politics, given the obsession with subsidizing these high-wage, high-income electric vehicle drivers and appearing to be politically supportive and green, all that good stuff, doesn't lend itself to the kind of factual discussion of what's best for the roads.
The bill you were referring to, I think, was only like 125, which wasn't enough.
Something's better than nothing, though. So
something's better than nothing, right?
All right. Well, we are again approaching the end here. I know you are. I want to make sure that folks listening are aware of this. You are involved with the New Mexico Association of Auto Dealers, but you're not speaking on their behalf.
I'm a member, but I'm not speaking on behalf. And I want to impress that across the board, automobile dealers, we're excited about all kinds of new technology and new products and ways to help our customers. And as long as they're affordable and we can meet the needs. What we're universally against is mandates. It's just there's too many moving parts to try to say you're going to sell 35% in 2026 of this particular vehicle. That just doesn't work out. Now there's questions of will they even be producing that many EVs? Will the manufacturers manufacture? And at the end of the day, when you have one state that's mandating it, have you really improved the overall emissions? The overall emissions will be affected more by the total production of EVs, not where they're sold, just where they're produced. Mm-hmm. So if one state sells 35% and the other state sells 8% because they can't get them, did you reduce the carbon emissions of the transportation system of a modern day automobile? No, you didn't. You just pushed it you pulled it from one state, you pulled from one state into another. And there's a couple of automobile dealers on our side that said, hey, let's sign up. We'll get all the EVs. We'll get our disproportionate share of the EVs, and then we can sell them to the people around us that don't get them. Okay, well, but at the end of the day, did you really improve the emissions of the country? And at the end of the day, it's how many did you produce and how many did you sell? So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your time today, enlightening us on this issue. As I mentioned,
it's complicated. Yeah.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
lots of
No,
moving parts.
I've written an op-ed, and I concur that I'm not, nor is the Rio Grande Foundation opposed to electric vehicles. I would only add that we oppose government subsidies that drive or force people, whether it's a cash subsidy or a tax credit or actual mandate, which is another form of subsidy that forces people or pushes people to buy this particular product above all others. So, I do appreciate your time. And can you just real quickly again plug your car dealership and or radio show?
Yeah. So Clif Horace, Horace Nissan Hyundai in Farmington, New Mexico. No additional dealer markup for 35 years. And we put on a radio show on the Big AM here in Farmington and in Durango and in Cortez every Saturday morning. It's Four Corners Car Talk, where we talk about all things automotive, and we talk a lot about EVs and the exciting things that are coming and how they work for some people and how they won't work for others. But there's all kinds of shades of gray. I mean, we think the perfect vehicle for the Four Corners will be a plug-in hybrid. So.
Well, I'm glad you had that Four Corners Car Talk in front.
Yeah.
You've been hit up on property or intellectual property from our friends at NPR and the famous show of the Car Talk guys over there, which is
at one point we applied to replace them, and so we have their blessing.
Oh, nice, good.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, thank you for sharing some time and your knowledge with us today, Clif. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.